Jonas parked the car on the dusty track, the tires creaking against the rocks that marked the end of the road. The engine died as he shut down the vehicle. The mountains stood before him, majestic and imposing, covered by a thin mist that danced on the slopes like vague ghosts. The air was cold and dry, and despite the summer heat that began to leave below, here above the wind cut, freezing the naked skin of Jonas who, without thinking much, already started to unpack the few bags. Isolation was what he wanted most. Since Katie left, the days and nights have become a blur of loneliness, pain and recovery. He knew that it would take time to try to reconnect with something, or perhaps to forget what had been lost. He could not stay at home, as Katie's memories in every corner. Then, I made the decision that seemed the only sensible option, to run away to the middle of nowhere. The hut was small, old, but solid. It was decades ago, maybe more. When he looked at the wooden roof, he saw signs of wear but nothing to scare him. The surrounding nature seemed peaceful, a world of tall trees, sharp rocks and murmuring streams. Here, he believed, he would find what he was looking for: silence, distance and a chance to finally analyze what happened. He took the keys from the cabin of the purse and opened the door. The crack of the lock ecological or mountain. The interior was dark, but with wood smell and clean air immediately involved. There was a small room with a fireplace, a simple kitchen, and a bedroom with a double bed that still had the marks of use. Jonas moved from the window and looked out, seeing the vastness of the world outside, untouched and silent. He felt a slight peace in his chest. For a moment, I believed that I had made the right choice. He sat on the couch, in front of the fireplace turned off, with his eyes a little blurry from fatigue. The journey to there had been long, and he knew that the weight of guilt and longing would only increase in the next few days. Tried not to think about her, but Katie was there, in all the images that his mind projected, in all the noises of the house. The silence of the mountain seemed suffocating. At night, the wind would blow through the trees, making the sound of leaves mix with something that Jonas could not identify. He was too tired to care about anything. He prepared a simple dinner and lay down, trying to convince himself that things would gradually get better. But before falling asleep, a sound cuts the silence. A distant whisper. Jonah froze. His whole body shook, the hairs on his neck shuddered. He stood there, trying to identify what that sound was. The voice sounded familiar, but he could not distinguish the words. I thought it was the wind. It was just the wind, thinking. But still, a part of him said there was nothing more there. Something he couldn't see. The silence returned, and Jonas tried to convince himself that nothing had happened. The heavy eyes, the tired body. He succumbed to fatigue and closed his eyes, but still the whisper lingered in his mind. He did not know yet, but the mountains had begun to whisper his name. Jonah agreed with this, the feeling that there was something moving inside the hut. The air was heavier, and the cold, which seemed more bearable during the day, now infiltrates the wooden walls, making the comfort environment. The clock on the wall marked almost 3 o'clock in the morning. He spoke to himself, his feet touching the cold ground, and walked to the window to spy out the darkness outside. The trees swung softly, as if dancing to the wind. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the feeling of restlessness only increased. As he looked at the landscape, something in the back of his mind began to move. Something was not right. What had been that? The whisper? He had not dreamed of it, he was sure. He remembered how the sound rolled in his head, as if a known voice called him. He tried to escape that thought. There was nothing there, it was just the isolation making his brain fantasize. The night was too quiet. He forced himself to go back to bed, but the feeling of being present did not leave him alone. The weight of darkness seemed to drag into his soul. As if something, or someone, was creeping through the shadows. He turned to the side, trying not to think about it, but suggestions began again. This time, closer. The voice seemed clearer, clearer. And it was at that moment that Jonas realized, without a shadow of doubt, he was not imagining things. Someone or something was there. The sound came from the direction of the front door, a low whisper, like a soft, almost intimate call. He quickly asked and walked to the door, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. When he sat down, he felt the cold air in his lungs and a feeling of heaviness, as if a presence was waiting for him on the other side of the door. He hesitated for a moment. Curiosity and fear mixed. He did not want to open the door, did not want to see what was there, but felt that there was no way back. With a heavy breath, he reached for the handle. Opening slowly, he came across the void of night. The field was dark, only illuminated by the faint light of the moon, which could barely cross the mist that spread over the ground. The wind cut the skin, but nothing else seemed to move. There was no one in sight. Jonas breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that he might finally be lost in his own thoughts. But then he saw. Something moves in the darkness. It was an indistinct figure, a shadow that seemed to drag along the edge of the forest, but that in moments disappeared into darkness. Jonah frowned, trying to understand what he was selling. The figure seemed to approach, but moved away as soon as he tried to focus. His whole body regretted leaving the cabin. A chill ran through his spine, and he had the urge to close the door, but something stopped him. A curiosity consumed him, stronger than fear. Not knowing what would keep him going, he took a step forward in the direction of the shadow that was crawling through the forest. With each step, the feeling of discomfort increased, and the voice again, lower this time, was heard. It was as if the shadow was whispering to him, as if he was trying to lure him to a place where he didn't want to go. Come. The voice whispered, like a cold breeze that seeped into his ears. Come to us, Jonah. He did not know that it was drawing him into that darkness, but felt a strange force, as if something was controlling his movements. Something beyond your understanding, beyond your will. With his body tense and muscles stiffened by fear, he advanced. The sound of his own steps seemed amplified in the silence of the night. When he looked back, he saw the hut now far away, a mere shadow in the distance. Everything he knew, everything he believed to be safe, was after him. In front of him, the darkness deepened, and the figure still called him, inviting him to follow. At this point, he no longer knew whether he was satisfied with the free choice. The voice inside his mind became stronger, more present, as if it was a living presence, guiding his movements. He was being drawn into the forest, into the heart of the night. And deep in his soul, he knew that he would not go back. Jonah did not know how long he had walked. The sound of his steps on the damp ground seemed to echo in his mind, but the fog and darkness left everything around him a blurred mass without depth. He was no longer in the clearing where the hut stood, but in an unknown territory, a dense and silent forest. The air was, as if it were nature itself watching him heavy. He breathed with difficulty, the fear of squeezing his chest, but still his feet continued to follow the path that he did not remember having chosen. The shadow in front of him, which was once an uncertain presence, now seemed more concrete. She moved with a supernatural agility, sliding between the trees as if it were part of her own darkness, always one step ahead, but never too far away. Jonas felt his mind getting cloudy, judgment crumbling at every step. The voice that called him, which was distant before, now echoed in his head as if it was screaming directly into his ears, and even then he could not understand what he said. "Come, closer." The voice whispered with a peculiarity that contrasted with the urgency it carried. Jonah tried to resist, he tried to stop, but his legs did not obey him. He was no longer in control. Each time he tried to look away, the shadow came closer, and the voice became stronger, more insistent. Fear or corrosion, but a curiosity, this strange and inexplicable force, kept it moving. He felt as if he was being pulled by invisible wires, and no matter how strong his will to stop, he could not. "You know what happened. Do you remember?" It was as if the forest was alive, as if it was molding itself around him, encircling him in a suffocating embrace. Each tree seemed to observe him, his dark and thick trunks as if life were necessary. The wind increased, but did not bring rupture. He felt the pressure in his ears, the whispers of dry leaves on the ground turned into undecipherable murmurs, distorted words that intertwined with the natural sounds of the forest. The figure in front of him stopped. The shadow now seemed more defined, but still not human. It was like a dark mass, twisting in an unnatural way, as if it had various forms, changing state every second. Jonas could not understand what he was selling, did not know if he was awake or if it was all a nightmare. But something inside him knew he should not move on. "You are near, Jonas. The truth is before you." The sentence is like an order. And then, the shadow moves away, going deeper into the forest. As if it was challenging you to follow it. Jonas felt an inner force, something primordial, that he said to run, to turn away and run away in that presence. But he couldn't. Each movement of his seemed to be guided by something greater, something beyond his comprehension. He began to walk faster, almost running, but the shadow, which had now become something more, seemed to be watching him, as if it was waiting for the right moment to finally reveal itself. The forest around Jonah began to change. Trees, before the ordinary appearance, are now more distorted, with grotesque shapes and twisted branches. The ground under his feet became sticky, almost as if he was attached to something. He took a snap behind him and, turning around, saw, among the shadows, a humanoid figure, a skeletal silhouette that rose from the depths of darkness. "You are lost," the figure said, his voice dry and hoarse, echoing in the void of night. "Here there is no way out." Jonas tried to scream, but his throat was dry. He wanted to run, but was afraid or paralyzed. His vision was blurred, his feet weighed as if they were stuck to the ground. The silhouette in front of him stepped forward, and the shadow that accompanied him seemed to grow, expand, taking the form of something even more monstrous, as if the darkness around him was manifesting itself in flesh and blood. "You don't understand, Jonas," the voice said again, now with an almost palpable intensity. "We've always been here. We've always watched. You will never escape." Pressure on Jonas' head increased. He felt his mind breaking apart, the reality around him starting to crumble. He no longer knew what he was selling or listening to. Everything seemed to talk in a whirlwind of oppressive and distorted sensations. The whispering voice, which before seemed inviting, now crushed him, as if it was inside him, feeding on his fear. Jonah fell on his knees, his body shaking, trying to process what was happening. But before he could understand, something secured his arm, a cold and invisible force, and he was dragged deeper into the darkness of the forest, where the shadow led him. Fear was no longer an option. He was beyond that now. He was lost. Jonas felt as if he was floating in an absolute emptiness. His mind was fragmented, a mass of memories and distorted images that merged and crumbled as quickly as they arose. Every step he took in the forest seemed to take him deeper into a web of hallucinations, as if reality was disintegrating around him. The shadow that now enveloped him seemed to feed on this disorientation, growing more and more, becoming something more tangible, a presence he could no longer ignore. He stopped, panting, his eyes fixed on a distant point in the forest where a clearing began to form, like an opening in the middle of nowhere. The fog slowly cleared, and as it approached, Jonas felt a pressure in his chest, a feeling of growing discomfort, as if he was about to relive something that had been buried deep in his mind. When he crossed the invisible line separating the dense forest from the clearing, he stopped immediately. In front of him, there was something familiar but at the same time unrecognizable. It was the old hut. The same hut he had left hours before, or maybe days, or even weeks ago. But now it looked different. It was covered by a layer of moss, its walls cracked and dark, and the roof seemed stuck to collapse. The surrounding air was dense, laden with a strange humidity, as if the hut itself were suppressing something that Jonah did not want to know. The shadow softened from his sight, but the presence of something evil still hovered over him. He was alone there, but the weight of it made him feel as if he was being watched. Each movement seemed to be accompanied by a stuffy breath, as if someone was lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. Jonah stepped toward the door of the hut, his hand tremendous as he touched the aged handle. The wood ranted under his touch, and the sound seemed to amplify in the deadly silence around. He came in, his heart beating frantically in his chest, but what he found inside the hut left him speechless. The interior was exactly as he remembered, but there was something wrong. The walls were covered with drawings and symbols, made of something that looked like blood, and the air was impregnated with a smell of completion. In the center of the room, a rustic wooden table was covered with melted candles and a large book, opened on a page that Jonas could not read. But the strangest thing was the presence of what seemed to emanate from the book, a feeling that he was being pulled there, as if the book itself was trying to connect with him. A soft but threatening voice whispered in your ear. You know what you need to do. Jonas felt the pressure on his mind increase. The image of his recent past, his wife, his life, everything began to merge with that distorted reality. He tried to remember what had happened before, which brought him there, but his memory was in pieces. Memories of something dark, something he had done but could not understand now, began to appear, but always accompanied by a veil of confusion. He looked at the table again and for a moment discovered a silhouette standing next to the book. The figure was short and thin, with empty eyes staring at him, but when he blinked, she disappeared. Jonah intended to approach, but his body seemed heavy, as if he was stuck on the ground. He felt a growing feeling of nausea, an uncontrollable desire to run away, but the shadows inside the hut held him like invisible chains. You can't escape, the voice said again, this time with a clearly disturbing one. Not after all that you've done. Jonas tried to resist, tried to get out of there, but the images managed to invade his mind. The past. That moment he feared most. The decision that led him there. He saw his wife, Clara, smiling at him, but there was something in the background that he did not want to see, an indistinct figure, a shadow crawling across the ground, watching them. He saw the rainy night, the accident, the blood on the road, the fight to save Clara. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember what happened next. What he had done. What he had lost. The pressure on his mind increased again. He felt the pain of something buried, something he knew he could no longer ignore. Something that was connected to the forest, the cabin. Something he had done in a moment of despair. But he didn't want to know any more. Did not want to face the truth. You're near, whispered the voice. Truth is waiting for you. The door of the hut closed with a bang behind him, and Jonah felt the ground tremble under his feet. The walls were distorted, the symbols on the walls pulsing as if they were alive. Reality was breaking up, and he knew he could not run away anymore. The shadow, now closer, stood before him as an imminent threat, ready to reveal what he had hidden all along. Jonah looked at the book again, the words now legible. He read them in a low voice, but when he spoke them, something inside his mind was courting, and he knew without doubt that there was no turning back. The sound of whispered words reverberates in his mind like a distant echo. When Jonah read what was written in the book, a shock wave ran through his body, as if the air around him had been distorted. The words he did not want to understand came to form in his mind, a terrifying understanding, but inescapable. You were the chosen one, Jonas. The voice, now stronger and clearer, seemed to emanate from all solutions, surrounding him, wrapping him in an invisible prison. He tried to move away from the book, but his feet were stuck on the ground, as if invisible roots had trapped him there. There was no more way out, there was no more way to escape the truth. He closed his eyes, trying to deny what he had just understood, but the images formed again before his eyes, sharper, more terrifying than ever. He saw Clara again, but it was not the sweet and warm smile that he remembered. It was an expression of fear, of terror, as if she knew what he had done, as if she already knew what he had sealed in that fateful moment. The shadow appeared before him, no longer a runaway silhouette, but an immense and terrifying figure. It was made of pure darkness, a vortex of darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. His eyes, if they could be called eyes, shone with a supernatural intensity, and Jonah felt his body tremble with fear. She was no longer in his mind, now there was a palpable and oppressive presence before him. You don't understand, Jonah, said the shadow with a voice that seemed to come from within your soul. The covenant you made was not with death. It was with what is beyond death. What you released in reviewing that contract, in accepting what seemed to be a way out, was the beginning of something that cannot be stopped. Jonah wanted to shout, but his voice did not come out. He tried to run, but his feet were still, his muscles paralyzed by the force of that presence. He was at the mercy of the shadow now, a slave to something he did not understand, something that had consumed him and would keep him captive forever. You killed Claire, didn't you? Said the shadow, and the words cut Jonah like a sharp blade. You sacrificed yourself. Not to save his own life, but to call upon the one who was sleeping. The pain of his loss was unbearable. Jonas tried to remove the images from his mind, but they keep coming back, more vivid, more painful. The accident. Oh, blood. Clara's look, full of despair, as he made that decision, not knowing what he was really doing. He had tried to save his life, trying to make the pact to ensure his survival, but did not know the price that would have to pay. The shadow moved from him, its shape darkening the room, and Jonas felt a cold shiver running through his spine. He knew that he was before the abyss, and the truth was clear now. He had surrendered to the unknown, the uncontrollable. He had sealed his fate, and in doing so had condemned Claire and himself. Now, Jonah, said the shadow with a grin that seemed more like a threat, there is no escape. You belong to me. Jonas felt his strength wane, as if his own vital energy was being drained from him. He tried to resist, tried to fight against the inevitability of his fate, but knew in his soul that he was lost. What he had done was no return, and there was no way to undo what was already sealed. He felt a huge weight in his chest, as if all the pain, all the regret of his life, was crushing him. And then, as if he himself disintegrates around him, he heard a distant cry. Clara's cry. He saw her again, but now she was no longer afraid. She was furious, her eyes shining with a supernatural light, and her expression of pain turned into an expression of revenge. You let me die, Jonas, said Clara, her voice echoing in the hut. Now you will pay the price. Jonah tried to scream, but the voice of Claire swallowed him up, and he found himself being pulled into darkness, an invisible force dragging him away, every cry of his soul echoing in the depths of the abyss. He wanted to fight, he wanted to return, but the power of the shadow completely enveloped him, swallowing him in a void that seemed to have no end. The last thing he felt was the cold touch of a hand that was not Clara's, but something else, something beyond human comprehension. Something that should never have been awakened. And then everything went out. The hut was silent, the forest returning to its natural state. But in the air, the presence still hovered, waiting, watching, as if it knew that the cycle was just beginning. Jonah agreed, but he was unsure of where or how. His body hurt as if it had been crushed by an invisible force. When he opened his eyes, he saw neither the oppressive darkness of the shadow, nor the cold emptiness that he felt before. Instead, there was a weak, dying light, filtering through a dirty window. The smell of mold and wood could invade his nostrils, and the air was heavy, almost dense, as if he was breathing something that was not completely air. He tried to move, but his muscles were weak, as if he had been torn from a long vigil. The memories came back slowly, like flashes, a sequence of distorted and fragmented images. A shadow. Clear. Oh, pact. The weight of guilt. But everything seemed distant, as if it had happened a lot longer than he really knew. Jonas was forced to stand, his head spinning with a try. He was in a hut, but it wasn't the same. It was older, dirty, with a sense of abandonment in every corner. The walls were wet, and the wood rancid with the weight of decades of neglect. He looked around, looking for something familiar, something that would give him an explanation, but all he found was silence. He moved from the window and looked out. The landscape was desolate, a dense and oppressive forest where the light of day did not seem to penetrate completely. The sky was cloudy, gray and heavy, and a thick mist covered the ground, making it difficult to see. Nothing seemed to be alive there. No sound, no movement. Just nature frozen, as if waiting for something. Jonah felt growing anguish, as if he was stuck in a place from which he could not get out. He knew, deep in his soul, that something was wrong. He had made a covenant, yes, but did not know exactly how. I did not know what it had aroused when I made that terrible choice. He was seeing and hearing things that he could not comprehend, and the shadow that had surrounded him, the shadow that seemed to be part of him now, was still there, lurking. He walked around the hut, trying to find a way out, an explanation, but all he found was the echo of his own steps, as if the place was empty, abandoned by whoever had lived there before. But something made him stop at a table in the center of the room. It was a simple wooden table, but on top of it, there was an object that made his blood freeze, the book. The book was there, opened in a page that he did not remember having read before. The title was unreadable, blurred by humidity, but the words he could decipher were recorded with a clearly frightening. You can't run away from what you are. Jonas felt a wave of terror invade his mind, a feeling that the place, that book, everything was waiting for him. He moved, hands trembling, and with an effort forced himself to look closer. The words began to form in his mind, more vivid than ever. There was no doubt. He had awakened something much greater than he imagined. Something that could not be controlled. Suddenly, the door of the hut opened with a bang, causing Jonas to jump back. He turned with his heart pounding, hoping to find some kind of presence, something that was watching him. But instead he saw someone who never thought would come back. Clara was there, standing at the door, her eyes empty and unexpressive, as if she were a shadow of herself. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his hair was loose, floating as if an invisible breeze moves. She was wrapped in a dense fog, as if it were not completely real, but rather a projection of something much darker. Did you think you could leave me behind, Jonas? His voice was soft but loaded with deep suffering. You thought the price of your salvation would not be so high. Jonah felt the pain of his words like a sharp blade through his flesh. He moved, but in doing so, the image of Clara was distorted, becoming more nebulous, more distant. It was as if she wasn't really there, but a manifestation of what he had done, a terrifying reminder of his mistake. You have condemned me, Jonah, she continues, her voice now more distant, as a suggestion from the depths of an abyss. But I'm not the one who will charge the price. It's not me. The fog around Clara increased, swallowing her figure. She slowly disappeared, like an image in the mist, and Jonah found himself alone again, with the weight of guilt crushing his soul. He had been consumed by what he invoked, and there was no redemption. He knew that Clara was not just talking about him, but something much older and cruel. What he had awakened now surrounded him in every corner, and there was no way back. He was caught, not only in that place, but in the shadows of his own actions, in the consequences of the covenant he would make. And the worst, he knew now, was that he was not alone. The presence he felt before, that shadow that had embraced him, was stronger now. He was waiting, watching, like a living and pulsating thing. And Jonah knew that his torment was just beginning. The mist enveloped Jonah, each step he took echoing in the void as a reminder that he had become. The hut now looked darker, more oppressive, as if the walls were closing in around it. He tried to remember what had happened, but the memories mixed, fragmented, confused, as if time had been distorted. The only thing that was clear was the presence that watched him, invisible and relentless, waiting for the right time to collect the price. Jonas felt the pressure on his mind increase every second. He knew that there was no way out, that there was no escape from what had become. He looked at the book on the table, now closed, but still pulsing with a dark energy. The covenant he made was there, inscribed in the pages, a promise sealed with blood and pain. He invoked something that he could not control, something that was now inside him. He looked at the corner of the room and saw the shadow again, denser, more vivid. It was a human figure, but not one he recognized. It was a distorted reflection of himself, with empty eyes and an expression of agony that seemed to extend beyond space. The shadow moved, faster than he realized, and now stood before him, his presence crushing and suffocating. Jonas could no longer distinguish reality from illusion. The shadow surrounded him, touched his skin, and he felt the pain it brought, as if it was a part of him. He tried to move away, but his legs did not respond, his mind was paralyzed by terror. The shadow began to speak, but his words were not words, they were cries, echoes of an existence that he did not understand. "You thought you could escape," said the shadow, his voice deep and distorted, "but everything has a price, Jonas. What you have done cannot be undone." Jonah closed his eyes, feeling himself sinking into the abyss. Fear took hold of his body, and he realized that there was no way to escape. He had tried to control the uncontrollable, made a pact with something beyond human comprehension, and now was paying the price. The shadow moved from him, and he felt his touch cold, as if being consumed by something that he could not comprehend. But before he could surrender completely, a voice broke the silence. It was Clara, her voice, soft and distant, as if she were speaking from somewhere far beyond this world. "No, Jonah. Don't let him win." He opened his eyes, and saw a familiar figure before him. Clara was there, not as a shadow but as a being of light, her presence radiating a warm and comforting energy. She sat down, and Jonas felt a warmth in his heart, a flame of hope he had not felt for a long time. "You're not alone," she continues, her voice now clear and firm. "You can end it. You can break the cycle." Jonas felt the light of Claire enter his chest, pushing away the shadow that surrounded him. He looked at her, and felt a wave of understanding. He could no longer run, could no longer hide behind the darkness. He had made a mistake, but now, with her help, he could agree. The shadow, still trying to rise again, began to dissipate, as if being pulled away by an invisible force. Jonas felt his energy fade, and the oppression in the air began to dissipate. Clara reached out to him, and he took it with renewed strength. Together, they walked out of the hut. When it arrived, the fog that covered the forest came down, and the sky, before gray and heavy, began to clear. The world around him was changing, turning back into something real, something he could understand. But the feeling that something was yet to come, something he could not control, appeared in his chest. Jonas looked at Clara, his expression now serene, but she inspired him with a slight sadness in the eyes. You did the right thing, Jonas. But not everything can be fixed. He felt a squeeze in his heart, but said nothing. He knew that his journey had not been accomplished. The covenant had been broken, but the consequences of his choices still followed him. The shadow, though now far away, still watched him, waiting. Jonas and Clara walked through the forest in silence, knowing that in the end the only way to really get rid of the darkness would be to confront what he had become. But for now, he was free. At least for a while.